Good morning. My name is Máximo Miccinilli. I'm Director Energy and Climate Change at the Center on Regulation in Europe, and I have a big pleasure to introduce Professor Catherine Banet, Research Fellow at CERRE and affiliated to the University of Oslo, Norway. Catherine, congratulations for the new report called State Aid Guidelines for Environmental Protection and Energy, EEAG, Review Process, Possible Changes and Opportunities. I truly believe this is the first of its kind because it has a very comprehensive list of recommendations. And I encourage all the energy and climate experts to go to cerre.eu and download this piece of research. Now, before we get into specifics, Catherine, could you explain for non-experts why the EEAG reform is so relevant?
Yes, indeed. The guidelines will be instrumental to both get the implementation of the clean energy package right, but as well the implementation of the European Green Deal strategy right. Just to clarify the things, EEAG, the acronym EEAG, refers, as you say, to the state aid guidelines for environmental protection and energy. And they are guidelines. That means that they are soft law instruments. That means as well that they are guidance instruments. They detail the criteria the Commission services will apply when assessing the compatibility of an aid measure considered to be a state aid and notified by a member state for getting approval. So the rule will be that the support measure will be in principle prohibited except if it falls under those exceptions defined in the guidelines. So therefore the guidelines are extremely important to know if the state measure can be approved. The guidelines are legally binding on the European Commission, but not on the member states in most cases. However, the member states know that if they want to get their aid measure approved, they will need to follow the criteria defined in the guidelines. So we can say that they have indirect legal effects. And in this approval process, the use of guidelines by the Commission aims to foster legal certainty and transparency. The guidelines that are subject to the report, the EEAG, apply to measures in favor of environmental protection and energy. There is a limited scope of application for those guidelines related to that objective, and measures related to, for example, nuclear energy or coal phase out, for example, will fall outside the scope of application and be assessed directly on the treaty provisions. So the current guidelines, EEAG, were adopted in 2014 and were supposed to end in December 2020, but have been prolonged until December 21. So the winter 2021 will be a crucial period for the revision of the guidelines.
Thank you very much, Professor. Now, the very same day of the presentation of your report, Vice President Vestager made an important announcement about how to green the competition policy. Now, I think your report seems to recall the centrality of the EEAG reform in the achievement of the new climate targets. So could you explain what does it mean in practice, and to some extent, how far or how close your report is to the announcement made by Vice President Vestager?
The report is very close to what the Commission has announced. So we find in the report some recommendation, but as well some basic reminders of the role of the guidelines. And the 2014 guidelines intended to assist the member states in reaching their 2020 climate and energy targets, and at the same time to prepare the ground for achieving the objectives set in the 2030 framework. The revised guidelines should therefore serve the same purpose of compliance with climate and energy targets under the 2030 framework and prepare the ground for climate neutrality by 2050 goal. Revision of ambition level under the European Green Deal needs to be considered too, with the proposed increase in greenhouse gases emissions targets, to be enshrined in the forthcoming European climate law and the revision of other secondary legislation like the Renewable Energy Directive. Those increases in targets will need to be mirrored in the guidelines, because the guidelines are the instrument to realize the measures. And as part of this compliance strategy, the report questions how the guidelines can contribute in notably fast-tracking decarbonization, make use of all technologies based on a technology neutral approach as far as possible, ensure progression through possibly a stepwise approach, and ensure a holistic approach for the whole energy system.
You suggest a kind of substantial evolution of the guidelines. And one of the key elements is the so-called combined approach of common objectives and specific aim measures. Many readers have already asked me, what does it really mean? So could you please explain and also tell us which other routes would still be possible?
In the report, we really wanted to question the fundamentals of the guidelines to get the broad picture, but as well to get the legal basis right. And we have to go back to the adoption of the 2014 guideline to understand the role of the methodology, how important it is, how the guidelines are structured as well. So during the previous revision process, an important improvement was made concerning the structure of the guidelines, with the first part of the document dedicated to a common assessment, list of common assessment objectives. Through that change, that means a common methodological framework for the application of the guideline was defined, with obvious benefits in terms of consistency and transparency. And the report argues for reiterating this approach. That being said, the report also questions whether there is a need to change further the structure and the scope of the guidelines, with three different alternatives. First one based on objectives alone, and those objectives can be formulated in terms of benefits such as environmental protection, climate mitigation or adaptation, system adequacy or flexibility, or resilience. A second alternative focusing on specific measures, so very detailed, and a third alternative consisting in a combined approach. And the report concludes in favor of the combined approach based on both common objectives and specific measures. To make that choice, the report also set a list of criteria, different elements to be considered: the general architecture of the stated law, the margin of appreciation left to the member state, the flexibility in the dialogue between the European Commission services and the member states during the approval process, the application of the proportionality test, the level playing field between the member states, and not least, the judicial review by the court.
You also seem to be a bit concerned about a potential disconnection between the EEAG and the General Block Exemption Regulation, known as GBER. Could you explain how they are interlinked now and the risk to disconnect both?
The guidelines are part of a legal ecosystem, and there is a close link between the General Block Exemption Regulation, the EEAG, and secondary legislation. The current EEAG, the guidelines, build on the provisions of the regulation, the GBER, and they detail them. Therefore, if the Commission intends to keep the same ecosystem of rules, it is necessary, in my view, to enshrine in the GBER the key principles and criteria for eligibility that the guidelines can build on. There is also a close link with secondary legislation. So the guidelines build on the provisions of Renewable Energy Directive, Energy Efficiency Directive, Electricity Directive, and regulation. And at the same time, they also prepare the ground for the next revision of the guidelines. So there is a link between those three instruments. The clean energy package needs to be implemented, and the guidelines are an instrument for that. But it was mostly an electricity package, so we have as well to prepare for a more holistic approach to an energy system. So that's an additional challenge when drafting the guidelines.
You have started to draft this report before the pandemic kicked off December last year. And then we have seen how the Commission also came up with a temporary framework for state aid. And we have all discussed about the different external shocks on the EU policy, the recovery plan. So many things have happened since you started this project. So question is, what we should be looking in the near future to ensure that state aid will be, rules will be robust enough to deliver the ambitious targets and to adapt to the new technology challenges.
There are important lessons to learn from the application of stated rules in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the experience gained from applying the temporary framework that you just referred to raises a series of fundamental questions for the future of EU stated regime in general and for the drafting of new guidelines specifically. That means first the scope of the guidelines, how it should be defined, the methodology, and the implementation of those guidelines. And there has been a greater emphasis on flexibility, for example, in the context of the application of the temporary framework. So that's something, consideration that the European Commission may want to reiterate in the new guidelines. As part of the green economic recovery post-COVID-19, one can also raise the question of the competence of the Commission to request member states to add green requirements when approving notified aids. And Commission Vestager, in her recent speech, has advanced some proposals such as a green bonus. So that will be another initiative, another proposal that will need to be followed up. And I also believe that the criterion of resilience, which is already present in some of the guidelines on state aid, should, in a much more greater extent, be considered in the guidelines in relation to the world energy system. And this can also be reflected in the definition of objectives of common interest that are also contained in the guidelines.
Thank you so much, Professor Catherine Banet. It has been a great pleasure to have you with us and also to discover a bit more the content of your report that again is available in the CERRE.eu website. I'm sure that we will continue as a think tank to contribute on this debate that has just started, and we hope that we will be able to integrate and think all together with the energy community how the post-pandemic, if there is any, will change the way we define guidelines for energy and climate.